Hi, my name is Shayla with Revolting Science Resources, a company designed to bring the principles of project management to academic scientists. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing some about how I would structure a research lab if I were running one, using some of the core job positions and roles within Scrum. So, first, I just want to preface this video by saying I am not, I have never been, and I likely will never be a PI in an academic research lab. So, all of the things I'm sharing here are my personal opinions, and they should definitely be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not blind to the fact that there are a lot of constraints as well as expectations that are placed on PIs that make maybe setting up a structure like this really difficult. So, honestly, if you are a PI and you're watching this video, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and maybe also sharing some with the people who are watching this video about things that you have to deal with that make setting up a structure like this really difficult. But although I'm sharing my personal opinions and ideas in this video, they are rooted in some of the actual principles and job positions that exist within Scrum specifically. So they're not just figments of my own imagination. But also, having been a researcher in academia for roughly 6 years, there are some clear holes that exist in the support, in particular of trainees, as well as PIs in academic research that I think a structure like this could actually greatly improve. So, before I dive into talking about the structure that I would create if I were running my own research lab, let's first start by defining Scrum. So, Scrum is an agile project management methodology that involves incremental actions over short periods of time with regular feedback and review. I've actually already shared a YouTube video on my channel that talks about the methodology of Scrum. So, I would definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't already. So, within Scrum, there are four key roles that can be translated into job titles that exist for companies that utilize Scrum methodology. So, kind of at the top of that hierarchy, you have stakeholders. So, stakeholders tend to be the people who have the vision or the ideas behind some sort of product or service that a company plans to offer. They may also include people who are funding the project. These stakeholders then directly communicate with the product owner. The product owner likely shares, or at the very least, has a deep understanding of the vision and goals that the stakeholders have for the product or service. And they essentially act as a liaison between the team members, the people actually doing the work, and the stakeholders. Then you have the Scrum Master, which serves kind of like the coach for the people doing the work or the team. They make sure the people actually doing the work are supported and remove any of the barriers to progress that might exist for them. And then you have the team itself. And these are the people who are actually doing the work needed to create the product or service that's being offered by a company. They have direct lines of communication with the product owner to make sure that the work that they're doing aligns with the goals and the visions that the stakeholders have for this product or service. And then they also work closely with the Scrum Master to make sure that any obstacles that might be in their way are removed and also get support if they need it. So these are the four key roles or job positions that exist within Scrum, described from a more corporate business perspective. But let's take these four roles or job titles and translate them into an academic research environment. So when we do that, the stakeholders become the PI, or the principal investigator of the lab. They're the person setting the goals and the visions for the lab as a whole and deciding the research directions, as well as securing the funding needed for the work that's intended to be done in the research lab. But unlike in a corporate setting, they generally have a responsibility to mentor and not just be the boss of the trainees as well as other people who work under them. This essentially makes the PI the point person for project objectives, goals, and assignments for trainees in the lab. Also, unlike how stakeholders primarily only have direct lines of communication with mostly the product owner in a more corporate setting, PIs actually will have lines of communication that exist between all of the different people that work within the lab. So, in this ideal structure for an academic research lab, the product owner would be akin to a staff scientist. As a staff scientist, their responsibility would include having a clear understanding for the visions and goals of the science that's being conducted in a research lab. They also might be responsible for things like training new grad students or undergrads who join the lab and making sure equipment is being used properly or maintained. They also would likely be responsible for conducting more long-term experiments or being involved in more long-term projects that might exist within the lab. That could definitely be trickier when you have more transient grad students, postdocs, or undergrads working in the lab. And lastly, they'd serve kind of like a consultant on all of the research projects that are being done in the lab. Although the specifics of research projects or who they're assigned to might be things that are discussed directly between trainees and PIs. The staff scientist in this scenario would basically be a person that could serve as a sounding board or help with some of the technical aspects of completing a research project. You can kind of think of them as the scientific support person of the lab. Next, a Scrum Master in a more corporate setting would be translated into a lab manager in an academic research environment. A lab manager would have the primary responsibility of managing all the different operations that exist within a lab. This would include things like organizing lab meetings, making sure items are ordered and stocked properly, maintaining any sorts of documentation or compliance with specific protocols or regulations, assisting with budgeting, and the list goes on and on. They would essentially serve as the administrative support or compliance person that exists within a lab. Another key responsibility they would have within the lab is serving as the operational or emotional support point person, especially for trainees that exist within the lab. And then lastly, the team that exists in a more corporate setting might be translated into the trainees that exist within an academic research environment. Trainees would include people like undergraduate and graduate students, as well as postdocs. The main responsibilities of trainees in the lab would be learning how to be in a research environment, which is the role that trainees play, but also driving short term projects and assisting in publicizing the work that's being done in the lab by going to various conferences or giving presentations, etc. And so, just like the actual titles themselves look a little different in a corporate environment, the lines of communication and association between these roles looks a little different in academic research. So, the PI actually has direct lines of communication with the staff scientist, lab manager, and trainees within the lab. And although everyone in the lab would also have direct access and ability to communicate with the PI, my recommendation would actually be for the strongest lines of communication going back towards the PI to be from the staff scientist and the lab manager. The idea with those two roles is that you want those to be people who are going to be there for the long term of the lab. So they're people that you've worked with for a very long time, you trust. And so when they give you feedback, that means something because you've developed this relationship and this trust with them. And so essentially, the staff scientist and the lab manager would serve as sort of accountability partners with the PI. What's also valuable about the structure of having the staff scientist and the lab manager provide some accountability to the PI is that you're getting accountability not only on scientific progress or the ideas or projects that are being delegated or designed in the lab, you're also getting feedback from some of the operations and administrative organization that exists within the lab. And then also, like I'd mentioned before, the staff scientist has direct lines of communication with the lab manager. And that's really important because it makes sure that the things that are happening within the lab align with some of the expectations or structures or systems that exist from an organizational or operational standpoint. The staff scientist would also have direct lines of communication with trainees, likely again in those aspects of training as well as project support. So the lab manager has direct lines of communication with the staff scientist. That can be really useful for ensuring compliance is occurring the way it's supposed to be, or various reagents or supplies are being flagged to be ordered or restocked. Lab managers would also have direct lines of communication with trainees. And the goal, again, would not only just be training and supporting them with operational and administrative tasks, but also being a source of emotional support. If trainees feel like there's some sort of issue or barriers occurring where they don't feel like they're able to share their frustrations or the difficulties or struggles that they're having within the lab with a PI directly, they have a point person that also exists within the lab that can maybe convey this information to the PI as well. Or maybe just kind of serve as some level of a mediator or almost like an HR representative, with their goal specifically being to support the trainees. And then for the trainees, their lines of communication exist between all three of these different roles and responsibilities within the lab. Although their strongest lines of communication exist with the PI as well as the lab manager of the lab. So this is the ideal structure that I would create if I were running my own research lab. What I really love about it is that as a I would be getting support from two people who would be people that I really trust and have been longstanding members of the lab likely. And I would be getting that support not only from a organizational or administrative standpoint with the lab manager, but also from a scientific standpoint with my staff scientist. Also, if I'm finding that I have a lot of responsibilities that are pulling me away from the lab, the staff scientist is there to be able to actually assist with doing specific experiments or making sure equipment or reagents and supplies are being utilized properly. And I don't have to worry about some of the very time consuming tasks of doing administrative support, compliance, and making sure paperwork and other things are filled out properly. The other thing I really like about this structure is for trainees, they're getting a lot of support. Their support is not directly tied to me as the PI of this lab. It is also shared with the staff scientist and the lab manager. and it provides a lot of guidance and support and people that they can go to within the lab if there are ever issues or things that arise that they need some support around. So, although I think this structure is ideal and how I would personally aim to structure my own research lab if I had one, I also recognize there are some clear constraints to setting up a system like this. And some of the biggest are that generally staff scientists and lab managers cannot apply for their own funding like trainees can. Although this is something I hope changes in the future, if you're a junior PI or you don't have the funding to fund these two specific roles within a research lab, kind of just got to work with how the system is. And so, in my personal opinion, if I were a newer faculty member, I just didn't have the funds to hire both a staff scientist and a lab manager, the most important person that I would hire would be the lab manager. In my opinion, they're one of the most important people that you can have in a research lab. And if I were running a research lab, and especially as a junior faculty, they would be one of the first people I would hire. I think, especially when you're talking about a new research lab as a junior faculty member, one of the reasons I think the lab manager is the most important person and one of the first people that you should hire is because you likely are going to be at the bench anyway, having to show people how to do experiments or making sure that the ideas and work that you're doing to establish your lab are understood by the grad students, postdocs, undergrads who begin to work with you. And especially if there are no current undergrads, postdocs, or grad students to start with, you're going to be doing those experiments anyway. And so, if you have someone like a lab manager that you hire first, they can really help free up your time to do the more important tasks of departmental obligations or various meetings, but then also the experiments that you need to actually generate data and continue to receive funding. By being able to kind of hand off some of those administrative or operational tasks to someone like a lab manager, especially when you're first starting a lab, that could save you a lot of time and give you more value for the time that you are spending doing work in the lab. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people can provide administrative support, but very few people can actually provide some of the technical scientific understanding and knowledge that's required to actually make your ideas and visions for your research lab come to life. So now let's just do a quick restructuring of this diagram for what it might look like if you're a more junior faculty member or someone who maybe doesn't have the funding for both a staff scientist and a lab manager. Again, you would still have the PI at the top of the structure, but when you're thinking about the responsibilities, they would not only have the same responsibilities that a PI had in the previous structure, they would also take over all of the responsibilities that the staff scientist had as well. And then, as some new personnel might be hired in the lab, some of those specific tasks might be delegated to some of those other lab members. You then have the lab manager for the lab, and their role would mostly stay the same. They're responsible for the operational as well as administrative support for the lab, but they're also responsible for serving as essentially advocates of trainees in the lab as well. And trainees would essentially, again, still have the same role. There might be some of the tasks that would normally fall to someone like a staff scientist in the previous structure that might be delegated to various trainees, but overall, their responsibilities would still remain the same. So, although the structure of these different roles is now a bit more linear, there would still be lines of communication as well as accountability that exist between all of the different members of the lab. So, those are my personal opinions about how I would structure my own research lab based off some of the specific job titles and roles that exist within Scrum. But before I wrap up, I'd like to just share 3 benefits that I see of using these particular roles in academic research, specifically when thinking about that ideal structure for a research lab, including both a staff scientist and a lab manager. The first benefit is that there's increased accountability for the PI. By having both a staff scientist and a lab manager that hopefully would be longstanding members of a lab that have gained the respect and trust of the PI of the lab, you have 2 different angles to serve as accountability to make sure that PIs are not straying from the goals and the visions and the ideals that they've set for not only their lab, but also for themselves. So there's that saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that within academia, we do encounter issues, especially when a faculty member is able to receive tenure, where it can be incredibly difficult for people to hold that faculty member or PI accountable for their actions, but then also be able to share just constructive feedback, especially when they hold a lot of power in your future career. So I think having these 2 roles of a staff scientist and a lab manager allow for different angles of accountability and the ability to provide more constructive feedback from people who have seen the lab over longer periods of time. And also lab members that are respected and valued by the PI. And so I think having a staff scientist as well as a lab manager serve as these sort of accountability partners for the PI can kind of help keep the power that they have a bit more in check. The second benefit is that it allows for increased support specifically of trainees. Personally, I'm a fan of providing the most support to the least powerful person in a room. And if we're talking about the structure that was laid out in this video, that's going to be the trainees. In the ideal structure for a lab, they're not only getting support from the PI, they're also getting support from a staff scientist, and then they have additional support as well through the lab manager. This also helps cover a lot of bases. They're getting the support from the PI in how to think like a scientist, come up with ideas, make progress on their research, write and publish and present on the work that they're doing. They're getting support from the staff scientist in some of the actual technical aspects of conducting the experiments they need to conduct or using equipment that's necessary for their project. And then they're also getting the support from lab managers and how to organize their work, organize the space that they occupy, be a contributing member operationally within the lab, as well as have a person who can be a sounding board if there are some things that they're struggling with personally. I also think an issue that exists within a lot of academic research labs is that most of the time, the main person that you have to go to, especially if there are issues that might arise in a lab, is the PI. And what do you do if the PI is part of the issue? I think, at least in the structure, there are some other options of people who, at least in the kind of outlined structure, have some power to assist and help. And there's more than one person to offer you that support. I think the third benefit of this particular structure is that it creates a division of labor that helps reduce the amount of workload that exists on any one person in the lab. I think in a lot of academic lab structures, both the PIs as well as the trainees have a lot of work placed in their labs. They are responsible for a large number of things. And I think by adding in these two key personnel to a lab, you're helping to free up some of that time for the PI so that they can do some of the most high priority tasks that they have on their plates, as well as for the trainees so that they can push their research forward. In particular, when you're thinking about people like PhD level graduate students who could be in labs for anywhere from 4 to 6 years. And a degree depends on their ability to graduate and leave from that lab. I think there needs to be more respect given to that. We generally do not pay grad students well at all. We expect them to work a lot and take ownership over their research projects, but sometimes we don't value some of the sacrifice that actually exists when you are paid at such a low level for so long. I think there can also sometimes be incentives to keep graduate students or postdocs around for longer than is actually necessary because you need someone who is skilled and trained to actually do some of the science and research, especially very long term projects. I think when you have a structure like this ideal structure I proposed in this video, you have a staff scientist now who can really take over that role. And so that can really help graduate students, postdocs gain the skills and experiences they need, have the opportunity to learn what they'd like to learn, but the work in your research lab is not dependent on their presence. I think we talk a lot about burnout in academia, not only from the trainees' perspective, from the PI's perspective as well. And I think that part of that is because there's too many tasks on everybody's plate. And so I think by adding in some of these additional roles and giving them sort of a revamped job description that makes sure that some of the key jobs that are being done in a lab are maintained, especially for long term, could be really valuable in just helping remove some things off people's plates, helping improve mental health in academia, and also preventing the high levels of burnout that we're seeing right now. So that's it for this video, where I've shared a little more about how I would structure a research lab if I were running one. But I'd actually love to hear in the comment section below. How do you structure your research lab if you're a PI? But also, what do you think are some additional benefits of this structure that could really improve academic research environments? If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like this one. But that's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.